So what we've done in the last couple classes is we've looked at cultural relativism, and we've seen that it has some fairly significant problems. What cultural relativism is, again, to remind you, is the idea that right and wrong are determined by what a society says and nothing more. And the big problems with this theory is that it implies that if a society were to say that, for instance, genocide is the morally right thing to do, then that just is morally right. Then massacring millions of people would be morally right. And it's stranger still because if you lived in a society that believed in genocide, then you would be doing something immoral to oppose it. It would imply that people who, for instance, stood against slavery at a time when our country allowed it were immoral. They were going against what their society said. Or people who opposed Jim Crow. Those people were immoral to do so. And this, I think, underscores what is the biggest problem with cultural relativism, is that it implies that there is nothing that is objectively wrong. But this seems counterintuitive because there does appear to be certain things which we have wide agreement are just flat out wrong. Murder, and by murder I mean the killing of innocent people, not killing someone in self-defense. That wouldn't be murder. Murder is killing an innocent person. This is wrong. Rape is wrong. Torture is wrong. And these things, they strike us even across various cultures. These things seem to be wrong. And we have a wide amount of agreement across not just our society, but across the globe that these things are wrong. Cultural relativism, if it's true, it says this isn't the case. And so the theory seems to fly in the face of something that seems fairly obvious. So where does this land us? Well, what I want to suggest is that as we move forward, what we're going to do is adopt what I'm calling a tentative moral realism. And when I use the word tentative here, I mean to use it the way that's probably somewhat familiar to you. For instance, we might say things like, well, let's tentatively meet at 5 o'clock, or let's have a tentative date of June 19th. And when people use the word tentative in this context, what they mean is we're setting this as the scheduled time we're going to meet. However, we recognize that if the situation changes, we might have to push the date or push the time to another day or another time. And so by tentative moral realism, what I mean is we're going to proceed as moral realists. We're going to proceed on the assumption that realism is true. However, this isn't something that's set in stone. If, for instance, problems arise with moral realism down the road, then we may have to modify our moral realism, or we may, in the end, have to reject it. So we're just proceeding on an assumption that realism is true, but with the recognition that things could change and it could turn out to be false. So with this in mind, we're going to move forward, and there are going to be some questions that we really have to answer, because all we have right now, all we've established is that certain things strike us as being wrong, and we have a wide amount of agreement on those things. However, one thing we haven't determined is what is it that actually makes these actions wrong? This is something that we haven't said at all. We agree murder is wrong. There seems to be a wide amount of consensus about this. But what is it that actually makes murder wrong? As it turns out, there are very different theories that try to answer this question. Another kind of question that's going to need to be answered is, how do we know when an action is right or wrong? To be sure, there are borderline cases where something appears right to somebody, but it doesn't appear right to someone else. So how do we distinguish and how do we determine and adjudicate who is in fact right and who is mistaken in this particular context? So these are going to be the types of questions we're going to be trying to answer as we move forward. And in trying to answer these, what we're going to be attempting to do is to erect a moral theory. And by a moral theory, what I mean is a theory that just explains these types of questions, that tells us what makes actions right and tells us how we know and how we decide in the difficult cases. So if we're going to begin by constructing a moral theory, we're going to need to start with premises or assumptions that are well established or seem undeniable. And the first theory we're going to look at does just this, is that it begins with some very intuitive starting points. And one of those starting points is just this idea. Consequences matter. Our actions have consequences, and those consequences matter to us. In fact, sometimes the end results are all that matter in determining whether or not something is good or bad or right or wrong. So think about this for a second. What is it that makes someone a good basketball player? Is it that they try really, really hard, or is it that they get results? If, for instance, you were building a team, a basketball team, would you put players on your team that worked really, really hard and tried really hard, but they never made baskets, or they couldn't block shots, or they couldn't snag rebounds? Or would you put someone on your team who made shots, who was able to play defense really well? What would matter ultimately in determining whether or not someone's a good basketball player? It's that they get shots. It's that they block shots. It's that they grab rebounds. It's that they can steal the ball. It's that they can pass the ball and get assists. It's not that someone who tries really hard is necessarily the best basketball player. It's the one who gets results. Or think about it like this. Suppose you had a rare disease that was going to lead to your death, and you had to choose between going to one of two doctors. Doctor number one, super nice guy. Every time you go in, has great bedside manner. He remembers your name, asks how your mother is doing. He's down in the trenches with you. He's like, we're gonna beat this thing. However, this doctor number one, half his patients die. Now there's doctor number two. He smells of alcohol, stains all over his doctor's coat. He cusses at you. He doesn't remember your name. Just a total jerk. But 98% of his patients go on to a full recovery. Now, who do you pick to help you out? Do you go with nice guy, doctor number one? Or do you go with the bad boy, doctor number two? Some of you are probably thinking of House from the TV show. So do you pick nice guy or do you pick House? And I think most of us, if our life is on the line, we'd go with doctor number two. I don't care if the guy's mean to me. I don't care if the guy smells of alcohol. I don't care if the guy is disheveled looking. What I care about, that he gets results, that he saves lives. That's what ultimately matters. And so this is our first starting point when we're thinking about erecting a moral theory. Our actions have consequences, and those consequences matter, and those consequences should play some role in deciding whether or not an action is moral or immoral. That's our intuitive starting point number one. Here's our second intuitive starting point. Happiness is good. Happiness is good, and pain is bad. We recognize this, and it seems undeniable. And I think this is something that if I had to argue for, if you had to ask me, well, why is happiness so good? I don't know that I would really have too much to say. I think it just seems that it's obvious to everyone and anyone is that your happiness is good. It's good to be happy. It's good to pursue your own happiness. We're motivated by the pursuit of our own happiness, and we try to avoid pain whenever it's possible. This is something that we call something that is intrinsically good or inherently good. And what that means is that we pursue happiness for its own sake. A lot of things we pursue for the sake of something else. For instance, a lot of us, we want to be rich or we want to have money. But really and truly, money is not intrinsically good. We pursue money because of the things that money gets us. Money pays the bill. Money puts food on our table. But just having money in itself, it's not something that's of intrinsic goodness. But happiness is. Why is it good to be happy? It just is. Being happy is something that's just a good state to be in. And being in a lot of pain is something that's just bad. Not only this, but we recognize that there's something wrong about a person, or something misplaced about a person who pursues their own misery. Now, certainly, you might allow for a certain amount of pain in your life at various times, but typically that's because you recognize that it has some good payoff in the end. For instance, I underwent knee surgery a few years ago, and I had to be on crutches for a month. But I did that because at the end of the light at the end of the tunnel was I could walk properly. So I allowed myself to receive this amount of pain for a brief period of time in order to have more happiness in the long run. And that seems perfectly fine and rational. But imagine someone who just pursues pain and suffering for themselves without having a really good end or purpose in mind. Imagine, for instance, someone who said, yeah, I can't wait until flu season this year. I'm looking forward to running a fever of 105 and having that pounding sinus headache. I can't wait. And you said, well, why? And they're like, oh, I just love it. I just love it where I can't see straight. You'd think that there's something warped about this person who said that. Or here's another example. When I was a little kid, I was really, really into skateboarding. Actually, I still do it when I get a chance, but I was really into it. And there was a kid in my hometown. I say a kid, he was like 21 and I was 13. And he was the hometown hero. He was just really, really good at skateboarding. He had lived in California for a while. I grew up in North Carolina in a really small town, so the fact that he had been to California made him seem cool and exotic. If you didn't know, California is the kind of mecca of skateboarding. But so it just made him seem even cooler. And I overheard him one day talking to someone else, and he said that his dream in life was to die of AIDS by the time he was 25. Now, of course, at the time when I heard this, I was like 12 or 13, and I looked up to him. I was just standing there, and I just said, cool. But that's not cool. That's stupid. And I don't think he really meant it. He was probably just running his mouth to sound punk rock or something, but it's really, really dumb, right? It wouldn't make any sense. And if someone really and truly thought that, if they really wanted to die of AIDS by their mid-20s, you wouldn't think, okay, sure, I understand, personally, I'm into gardening, I have my own hobbies, you want to die of AIDS, to each his own. You think, this person is irrational, this person needs psychiatric help. Nobody in their right mind would want this kind of thing. And so I'm mentioning all of this just to highlight this point that your own personal happiness is intrinsically good, and pain, suffering needlessly, that's intrinsically bad. And it's these two intuitive starting points. They've been taken and put together in order to construct a moral theory. And this theory is known as the theory of utilitarianism. And what the theory of utilitarianism says is just this. Actions are right insofar as they tend to promote aggregate happiness, and wrong insofar as they tend to produce aggregate pain. The theory of utilitarianism, it adheres to this basic principle known as the principle of utility. And the purpose of this principle is to answer those questions I was mentioning earlier. What is it that makes an action right or wrong? Well, if it promotes aggregate happiness, then it's right. If it fails to promote aggregate happiness, or it promotes more pain than happiness, then it's wrong. And furthermore, it tells us how we go about deciding when an action is right or wrong. What we do is we can take a particular action. We consider that action, say, well, will this lead to more happiness? If so, then you should do it. Will it lead to more pain? If so, then you should not do it. And this might sound a little confusing. You might be thinking, wow, there's a lot of language here promoting aggregate happiness. But the reality is this is a kind of complicated way of saying something that's fairly simple. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard before that the right action is the one that produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This is actually a very, very common, intuitive way of thinking about rightness and wrongness. You look at action and say, what's going to produce the best consequences? And here, the best consequences, what we have in mind in particular, is going to be happiness, or what's going to produce the worst consequences. And again, by worst consequences, what we mean is lead to the most amount of pain and suffering. Now, this is a simplified way of putting the point, the greatest good for the greatest number. Later on, we're going to go over some reasons as to why this is somewhat of an oversimplification and somewhat imprecise, but I think as a general introduction to the theory of utilitarianism, it helps communicate exactly what the theory is driving at, or at least roughly what the theory is driving at. Now, the theory of utilitarianism, it is a consequentialist theory, and what that basically means is that it's only concerned with the outcomes. It's only concerned with the consequences. Just like a moment ago when we were talking about what makes someone a good doctor or a good basketball player, as I said there, what matters most is the outcomes, the end results. The theory of utilitarianism says the exact same thing, that all that matters is, does this action lead to the most happiness or does it lead to the most pain? And that's what we're ultimately interested in when we discuss the theory of utilitarianism. Now, before I go into some nitty-gritty details, I just want to say a little bit about the theory of utilitarianism and why it might seem initially plausible. Not only does it rest on what I deem to be some very intuitive starting points about consequences mattering and about happiness being good and pain being bad, I think it squares with our general moral intuitions. So I want you to consider this kind of scenario right here. Imagine you live in a small town and the town is on the verge of bankruptcy, and if something radical isn't done, then the town is just going to go under. A lot of people are going to be homeless. It's going to be really bad. And so the town has to make a decision about how to go about bringing more revenue and increasing the overall well-being of people within the city. And one proposal on the table is to build a new factory in the city. The city has been deemed worthy of, I don't know, we'll say having a BMW plant or something come to the town. The only problem with this is, in order to build this factory, there are only 2 suitable locations. And one of these locations would require destroying 5 houses. And let's suppose that each one of these homes has 4 people living in it. And then we'll suppose that each house is roughly worth, we'll just say $200,000. And then the other location that would be suitable for building the factory, it would require destroying only 1 home. And let's suppose that this house is worth $200,000 and there are 4 people living in it. Now, with this being said, it seems we have 3 options. 1, we could do nothing and allow the town to go bankrupt and allow increased homelessness and probably crime and things like that. That doesn't seem like a viable alternative. So the remaining 2 options would be, we could destroy 5 houses or we could destroy just 1. And I want you to ask yourself, what seems to be the most suitable course of action? I think that what most people agree, and this has been true when I've asked this to classes before, is that most everyone says you should destroy just the 1 house. Why? Well, because destroying the 5 homes would create more pain and suffering in the world. It would displace 5 families, roughly 20 people. It would cost the city, because the city would have to make restitution. It would cost the city about $1 million. Whereas destroying the 1 home, it would produce the desired effect of being able to build a factory and provide more jobs, but it would only displace 4 people and only cost the city about $200,000 in restitution to the family. So this just seems obvious. It seems obvious that in this case, what you want to do is produce the least amount of pain and suffering in order to generate the most overall happiness. And if someone were to protest and say, no, I think you destroyed the 5 homes, we wouldn't take them seriously. I think we'd consider them confused. We consider them off base. Now, you might ask, well, what if they had a really good reason? What if their reason was, I don't know, what if someone protested and they said, well, because this is my home and so it's more important? I don't think any of us would buy that because, everybody's going to feel, the person living in this home and the person living in this home and this home, everybody's going to feel that their house is the most important. But we don't make the decision based on just that one person's personal feelings. Rather, what we're trying to do is make the right action based on what's going to lead to the greatest overall happiness in the long run. And again, what we say here, the right action would be the one that creates the least amount of pain to lead to the most overall happiness. But if you're thinking like that, and if you do agree that destroying the 1 house is the right course of action, then you just adopted the principle of utility. You've thought like a utilitarian. You decided this decision on utilitarian ground. Now, let me provide you with another thought experiment that's very similar to the previous one. And this one basically is asking you to make a similar kind of choice, only it's kind of upping the ante a bit. Suppose that you had a mad scientist or something. I don't know, why do we always pick on scientists? We'll say a mad philosopher instead. We'll pick on philosophers. And let's suppose this mad philosopher, he had kidnapped 6 people. And he had placed 5 of them, he tied them up on a railroad track. And then he had also tied another one on this other railroad track. And let's suppose that he had dismantled the brakes on this trolley car. And the trolley car, if it just continues on its present course, it's barreling down this track. And if nothing is done, it would just continue along this track and kill 5 people. Now, let's just say they're innocent people. None of these people are murderers or anything like that. They're just average, ordinary, tax-paying citizens. We got Bob the Builder here, Dora the Explorer, Ted the pharmacist, I don't know. Just ordinary, everyday citizens right here. All of them are good people. And if nothing is done, the trolley would just keep going and kill these 5 people. However, let's suppose that he's placed you at this switch right here, and you have the option. You can throw the switch, and by doing so, it'll divert the trolley car down this path. Now, let's just suppose that, however, he's also tied one person up on this track right here. So if you throw the switch, it's going to lead to killing this one person. And we'll also assume, for the sake of argument, that that one person is just an everyday, average citizen, just a good tax-paying citizen. So you're basically confronted with this scenario here. Do nothing and let 5 people die. Throw the switch, save 5, but kill 1. And we can also suppose this isn't drawn to scale and that you don't have time to run and save them all. You have to make a choice. Either allow 5 to die or throw the switch and end up killing 1. What do you think is the right course of action? Should you do nothing and allow the 5 to die? Or should you throw the switch and send the trolley car down the path to save the 5 but kill the 1? And here again, some people feel conflicted about this, but what I've discovered is that the majority of people in this situation think that the right course of action is to throw the switch and save 5 and kill 1. And why? What makes that determination so? Well, it's just this. Throwing the switch is going to minimize the amount of pain and suffering in the world. If you allow the trolley car to just keep barreling down, you're going to kill all 5 of these people. And not only will you have 5 people here who are, savagely killed, but you have to think of their families. Let's suppose that, guy number 1 right here, he's got a family and 50 people are going to be made sad as a result. Same thing here. 50 people are going to be made sad. 50 people are going to be made sad as a result. And so you're going to have, basically 250 family members total, plus the 5 right here, who suffer tremendously. Whereas if it goes this way, we'll just assume for the sake of argument that you'd only have 50 plus the 1, so 51 people. So when you compare the amount of pain and suffering that would be generated by allowing 1 to die or killing 1 versus allowing 5 to die, it just seems that if you allow the trolley car to continue straight, that you'd have way more pain and suffering in the world. And so the right course of action here is being dictated by the net results, by the outcomes. What's going to lead to the least amount of pain? And if you agree with that, then you've basically just committed yourself to thinking like the utilitarian. Now, this is, I think, so far what we've said is some driving at some basic intuitions we have about moral theorizing. But the theory of utilitarianism really received a more explicit and a more formal expression back during the late 17 and early 1800s. And there were a group of philosophers and economists, actually, and theorists of various sorts who first championed this idea and tried to make this, what I'm calling, I think, I don't want to overstate it, but somewhat of a common sense way of thinking about the world, a way of making judgments, and make it much more precise and much more sophisticated. And one of these early pioneers for the theory of utilitarianism was this man right here, known by the name of Jeremy Bentham. And Jeremy Bentham, he was a well-known English lawyer, philosopher, political theorist, and social reformer. And what I want to share with you are just a few interesting facts. And you see, back when he lived, keep in mind the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War, the Declaration of Independence was 1776. So the Revolutionary War took place shortly thereafter. So you can see that he lived a long time ago, but look at some of the things he advocated for: individual and economic freedom, separation of church and state, equal rights for women, decriminalization of homosexual acts. At one time, you could actually go to jail for engaging in homosexual activity. The abolition of slavery and the abolition of the death penalty. So I mention that because a lot of times we think some of these ideas are very, very new, but they've been around and there have been people defending these very progressive notions for quite a long time. Probably the thing that's most interesting about Bentham that a lot of students will remember is that he actually had his body mummified and put on display at University College London. And in fact, this right here is his mummified body. They keep it in this glass display, as you can see here, and every year they wheel him out. The faculty at this school, they have a big banquet, and they'll wheel him out in this glass case, and they'll set him at the head of the table while the other faculty have their banquet. It's very, very strange. But one other interesting fact is that his head actually went missing. This is a wax head here. His head went missing. It's really unclear exactly how it went missing, but some people speculate that students would steal it for student pranks. And so that's a wax head they created. The real head was discovered years and years later in an archives room, but it had decomposed, so they didn't want to use it because it would look like The Walking Dead if they were to have used it. But Jeremy Bentham was an early pioneer of classical utilitarianism, and what he wanted to do is he wanted to take these kind of natural intuitions we have about that it's right to minimize pain and right to produce as much happiness, and give it a more precise, even kind of scientific way of making things precise, and use a scientific approach to moral decision making. Another early pioneer of utilitarianism was this person, John Stuart Mill. And he was actually a student of Jeremy Bentham. John Stuart Mill's father, John Mill, was actually very good friends with Jeremy Bentham. And so when John Stuart Mill was growing up, he would go and he would listen to his father and Jeremy Bentham discuss utilitarianism. And he would basically listen, hear what they have to say, and he sort of soaked it up as he was growing up. John Stuart Mill was a child prodigy. He learned Greek at age 3. He learned Latin, geometry, and algebra by age 8. I believe he had written a history of the world by age 12, and by age 20 had a complete and total nervous breakdown. Now, he recovered from this breakdown afterwards, but he did have it around, like I said, age 20, and I think that's because he had a fairly overbearing father. His father made him study and work all the time, and his father's reasoning was that if John ever got any kind of sense of leisure or play, he wouldn't want to study, so his father just made him work. Some of his famous works include On Liberty, System of Logic, Utilitarianism, and then The Subjection of Women. And in this final work right here, he actually goes to considerable lengths to argue that women should have equal rights as men, which again, that's a very progressive idea that you see being represented a long, long time ago, over 200 years ago, in fact. So that's, I think, a very interesting point about John Stuart Mill on a personal level. He's actually the one whose name is most often associated with utilitarianism. He did more than Bentham to popularize it, and he wrote about it in actually newspapers and magazines of the time. So before I tell you exactly the ways in which John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham refined the theory of utilitarianism, I just want to say a little bit more about some various ways in which we do, in fact, reason like utilitarians. And the reality is even though it's a philosophical theory, it's a very natural way to think about the world. And in fact, I think we use utilitarian reasoning very regularly, and in ways that sometimes aren't exactly observable. Like, you wouldn't say, hey, I'm thinking like a utilitarian right now, but you do think like a utilitarian and make your decisions on the basis of utilitarian kinds of reasons. So here's an example from just an ordinary happening in life. I'm sure some of you have been through to McDonald's or Hardee's or somewhere like that before. You've gone up to the counter and you've ordered a milkshake or you've ordered an ice cream. And inevitably, it seems like the response you get, if you do it later in the day, the response you get is, ice cream machine is broken. All right, ice cream machine is broken. I've heard this 100,000 times, it feels like. And I've often wondered, like, how do these machines break all the time? Are these things, they delicate pieces of equipment that are balanced by laser precision? I mean, they look like big clunky machines that could take a beating. I don't understand how these machines break on a daily basis. But I've often suspected that this is not entirely truthful, that it's honestly a load of BS when they say that machines are broken. And one night I went through the drive-thru at my hometown McDonald's. It was 8:30, and I ordered my milkshake. I ordered an Oreo McFlurry. I've been craving my Oreo McFlurry for a while. I was like, I'm going to get my Oreo McFlurry. And I go through the drive-thru, I place my order, and the young girl says to me, "Oh, we stopped serving ice cream at 8. To which I reply, "Well, your sign out here says you serve it till 9, which it did. It says, serves ice cream until 9. And to which she replied, she went, machine is broken. Now, clearly, I was just lied to. The machine wasn't broken. What had happened is they decided to break the thing down earlier so they could get out sooner when the McDonald's closed. She had lied to me, and it was very, very obvious. And so what I decided to do was, I was thinking, I was like, I'm going to go in there, I'm going to give them a piece of my mind, I'm going to fuss, I'm going to argue with them. This is a crime against humanity here. You don't treat people this way. You don't lie to them. And in the 2 seconds that I thought through that, I decided, oh wait, why am I going to do this? This makes no sense. I'm going to go in there, I'm going to raise a stink over a milkshake. And I'm going to yell at this young girl who probably, it wasn't her decision to begin with. It's going to get her manager involved, who's going to be angry and probably yell at me. And the customers behind me is probably going to make them angry as well. They're going to be thinking, I can't believe this guy's making such a big stink over a milkshake. So I'm going to end up making all these people mad. I'm going to get more angry. Furthermore, I'm probably not getting my milkshake anyway. And finally, I could just drive across the street and go to Burger King and get an inferior milkshake, but I can get something nonetheless. What I ended up doing was just driving home and not having anything, which was actually probably the best course of action in the end. So basically what I did here is I was thinking, well look, someone has just wronged me. Now it's not a serious, egregious wrong, but I was lied to. And so someone wronged me. But I didn't press the issue. Why? Because I just started considering the consequences of any kind of action that it would take in order to make us think about it. And when I considered the total consequences, it just didn't make a lot of sense. And so even though something wrong had been done to me, I just had to say at the end of the day, let it slide. Why? Well, because the consequences dictated that I shouldn't do anything about it. And what I did then is I made a decision based on a utilitarian type of calculation. Now, at the time, I wouldn't have called it utilitarianism. I wouldn't have said, wow, I'm a good little utilitarian, I'm thinking like this. It seemed like the right course of action to me at the time. Now, upon reflection, I've realized that was utilitarian reasoning. But my point here is that I think utilitarian reasoning, it is embedded within a lot of decisions that we do make. Even decisions as simple as purchasing an ice cream or being lied to about trying to get your McFlurry. I'm still kind of bitter about it, I must say. In any event, that was a simple, ordinary case of utilitarian reasoning. I want to provide you just a few more examples of this. And here's one that's actually taken from a very good movie. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it, but this is taken from Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. For the three of you who are Star Trek or sci-fi nerds like myself, hopefully this will be fresh in your memory. For those of you who aren't, let me just explain what's going on here a little bit. In this particular scene, what has happened is that the Starship Enterprise is... there's a bomb outside of the ship, and it's set to blow up. And if it blows up, it's going to kill all 1,300 people on the ship. And the ship's engines aren't functioning, and it can't get away from the bomb fast enough. And the only way to get away from the bomb quickly enough is for someone to go in this room that's flooded with radiation and do something to the engines to bring them back online so that it can zip away. And of course, if you go in this room, it spells instant death. And so Mr. Spock right here, he takes it upon himself. He goes in this room, he does the mechanical things necessary, he brings the engines back online, and they zip away. But as a consequence of this, Spock dies. And as he's slowly dying, he's having a final conversation with his lifelong friend right here, James Tiberius Kirk, Captain Kirk. And Captain Kirk says to Spock, his first question is, why? To which Spock says, it is only logical. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, or the needs of the one. And what Spock did is he justified his decision on straightforward utilitarian grounds. Kill one to let 1,300 live. And that is a very, very straightforward, explicit utilitarian use of reason right there. It's a very good scene. I encourage you to go watch Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. It's easily the best of all the Star Trek movies. It's a little old, but I think it's stood up fairly well. Well, these are a few examples. I want to give you a couple more, and that'll be done for today. But here are a few from wartime decisions that have been made in the past. And during World War II, the Germans used a secret code known as the Enigma Code. And basically the Enigma Code, it was an uncrackable code. It was so complex, there's no way possible to crack it. And in fact, even the people who used the code, you had to have a special decoder in order to crack the code that was being sent to you. So if one German was sending the other German a code, you could only understand it if you had this special decoder. And even with that decoder, you had to have certain instructions on how to use it because the code was always changing. And so we actually got one of these decoders. We were able to capture one, and then it took a team of logicians and mathematicians and cryptologists a while, but they were able to crack the code once they had this decoder. And this gave us all sorts of inside information on exactly how we should go about responding to what the Germans were doing. We knew where they were going to place troops, where the artillery was going to be. We knew where they were sending supplies. So we had all kinds of valuable inside information that they didn't know that we had. Well, one of the things that was revealed during this process is that the Germans were going to bomb a city, Coventry, in the United Kingdom. And the Prime Minister of the time, Winston Churchill, he was faced with a very, very difficult decision. He could, on the one hand, evacuate the city. However, if he went about evacuating the city, the end result would be that it would tip the Germans off that we had cracked their code. Because, it would just be an otherwise very strange set of circumstances that the day that the message was sent out just happened to be the day that Coventry got evacuated. So the Germans would probably suspect that maybe their code was compromised. On the other hand, he could do nothing. He could allow the city to get bombed, and the Allies, us, we could maintain that kind of strategic advantage that we had by having access to the code, but the Germans not knowing that we had access to the code. And so Churchill faced a very, very difficult decision here. It wasn't so easy. You might think, well, why didn't they send people to fallout shelters or things like that? But again, if you did that, there'd probably be a lot of people mass exiting the city. I don't think anybody is going to just sit around and willfully get bombed for the sake of the war. So Churchill really and truly, it didn't seem feasible for him to tell anybody in the city about the impending bomb raid. And what Churchill ultimately decided to do was to allow the city of Coventry to get bombed. He let innocent men, women, and children die. But here's the thing. Some war experts have estimated by having access to the Enigma code, it basically ended the war in Europe 2 years sooner than it would have otherwise ended. And so the net result is millions of lives were probably saved. At one point, I think, in some of the German concentration camps, they were killing around 10,000 Jewish people a day. And there's people that I don't remember the total number of people who were killed in Coventry as a result of that bombing. I would speculate maybe a few thousand. But think about the trade-off there. Allow a few thousand to die, or, in order to save millions, or save a few thousand and allow millions to die. And Churchill made his decision based solely off of the numbers, the end result. What's going to lead to the least amount of pain and suffering? And so this decision was reached by an act of pure utilitarian reasoning. And hopefully you can see here, as I was saying, we use utilitarian reasoning. We see it in movies. We use it on a daily basis. We see it emerge even in very, very serious decisions that are made in wartime. I want to give you one final example of utilitarian reasoning, and we'll be done for the day. And this occurred in the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I'm sure some of you probably know, but these were the only times that atomic bombs have been used in the history of warfare. And the bomb on Nagasaki killed about 80,000 people. And think about that for a second. 80,000 people killed as a result of one bomb. That's just astounding and staggering. Why did we use this weapon? Why did we use it twice? Well, this has been a question that a lot of people have asked over the years. But at the time, the decision was reached by President Harry S. Truman. And what Truman said, and he actually said this explicitly in radio interviews, is that he wanted to bring the war to an abrupt and sudden end. The Japanese had vowed that they were going to fight until every man, woman, and child was dead. And calculations had been constructed that the war would go on for another couple of years, and at least 1 million people would die if we went in a land invasion. And so what Truman decided to do was to drop the atomic bomb. And as a result of this, the war did come to a sudden and abrupt end. Now, some people have argued whether or not the second bombing was necessary. I don't want to get into that. But here's the reasoning behind Truman's action. Do I allow a land invasion, or do I call for a land invasion and drag this war on for 2 more years and allow millions of people to die? Or I can end the war tonight and by making one decision. I kill 80,000 people, but I save roughly 1 million lives. And what he decided to do in that case was to drop the atomic bomb. And like I said, the war, as a result, did come to an abrupt and sudden end. And what guided his decision, and as I said, he says this very explicitly in several radio interviews, it was this idea that it would lead to less overall pain and suffering in the world if he went ahead and dropped the atomic bomb. And so he was basically making his decision once again on utilitarian grounds. And so hopefully you can see through these various examples as to why the theory of utilitarianism should seem, at least at a first pass, very plausible. Why? Because we do use it in our day-to-day lives and just simple decisions. Not only that, we see that it's represented in more serious decisions, such as those we observe in wartime. I gave you some thought experiments earlier about destroying 5 homes versus 1, or killing 5 people versus killing 1. And again, the theory of utilitarianism seems to line up with what are our basic ideas about right and wrong.